Hey, this is Matt. I'm going to do a review of the album The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway by Genesis. This is their double album, the last album to feature Peter Gabriel. It was a difficult recording session. Peter Gabriel actually was approached by William Friedkin, who had directed The Exorcist, about joining his creative team. While they were working on this album, and he sort of flirted with the idea, toyed with the idea for a little while, and then I think Friedkin was afraid that he was going to break up the band, and so he told Peter Gabriel basically go back to the band. He says this isn't worth breaking the band up for. I just wanted to kick some ideas around. But at that point, the rest of the band, Phil, Tony, Mike, and Steve were like, well, hey, if he sort of leave us on a lark like this, when's the next shoe going to drop, and there was some friction there. And then, of course, when they completed the album, midway through the tour to support the album, which was a difficult tour, Peter Gabriel did make the decision to leave Genesis, but he continued touring to finish out all of the dates that they had booked. So, he was a trooper. He stayed on with the band, certainly didn't cut the tour short. But it was a really ambitious tour they did for this album. They actually went on tour and played the double album in its entirety, and then played one or two encores of their older material. And they started doing this before the album was even released. So they would play the entire album to people for the first few dates of the concert, before anyone had even heard these songs, because the album hadn't been released yet. And I don't even know if they released any singles. I don't think they did release any singles ahead of the tour. So wow, that's a pretty ambitious idea. But and they had slides that of course the concept behind this album, it is a concept album. It tells a story, and they had slides that they were showing on projecting on the screen behind them during the tour that would sort of tell the story. And unfortunately, there's not much bootleg footage that exists of the tour or professionally recorded footage. Unlike some of the earlier tours they did, there was quite a bit of professional footage, at least for the time period. So we have a lot of the songs prior to this on video, documented live. If you go on YouTube, like Supper's Ready, they got a couple different videos of Peter Gabriel and Genesis doing Supper's Ready, and several of their other older songs. But unfortunately, nothing on this tour was captured on video professionally. There's some 8mm clips that people who went to some of their concerts did capture, but and it's sort of, people have tried to piece together those clips and try to make it into a sort of hodgepodge concert film. Some amateurs who've done that, but of course, nothing that really is very high quality or that captures the experience terribly well. And of course, after Peter Gabriel left the band, they did continue to perform several of these songs with Phil Collins on lead vocals, and of course there's some good quality professional and amateur video of that. So songs like In the Cage and Carpet Crawlers, and even like an instrumental version of Fly in a Windshield, and the title track, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, with Phil Collins on vocals. Those have all been well documented, but a lot of the other songs haven't on video of them live. Of course, definitely not with Peter Gabriel either, except in these very rough 8mm films and clips. So, yeah, and it is a story. It's sort of a Peter Gabriel described it as sort of a pilgrim's progress through the mind. And if you like the movie Inside Out, you might like this. That cartoon about emotions going through someone's head. It sort of has sort of the same vibe the story does, even more abstract though than that movie, and sort of like a quest, like the Phantom Tollbooth, or of course the aforementioned Gulliver's Travels, sort of an allegorical tale of a Puerto Rican New York gang member, or ex-gang member potentially, who sort of gets sucked into this like fantasy world, I guess you could describe it, or some sort of world of his own subconscious, perhaps, and goes on this journey. There's lots of literary and mythical allusions along the way, as was par for the course with the band at this point. But it's interesting that they did choose a character for Peter to embody, who was, of course, much different than Peter himself was. And, being a British band who went to, the core members, of course, including Peter, Tony, and Mike, went to private school to boot within Britain, and then yet they pick a Hispanic youth as the hero of their story, and for Peter Gabriel to portray. And of course, they don't portray him fairly accurately. They still use a lot of British slang in the lyrics, but at least it was an interesting idea for the band to do this. And it's not done, I don't think, in a certainly not done in a demeaning way or a mocking way. Peter doesn't try to affect any kind of accent, which was a very good idea on his part, much better than I wish Phil Collins had taken that cue when they had done the song Illegal Alien, which is, of course, highly problematic. That came much later in their career, of course, 9 years later. But here, it doesn't. I guess it doesn't. It doesn't factor in the story a whole lot, besides being sort of an incidental fact about the main character. But it is interesting to make him sort of a working class kind of kid who lives in the streets, and that's definitely not sort of the crowd that the band was catering to, nor was it the sort of background of most of the band themselves. I mean, Phil and Steve had somewhat of a working class upbringing, but they didn't really have much input into the story itself. So Peter Gabriel wrote all the lyrics for this album, which actually was not the norm before this. Peter Gabriel would write a few individual song lyrics on his own prior to this album, but often the band would collaborate to write lyrics, or Tony would write some lyrics, or Mike would write some lyrics on his own, or even Steve would write a few lyrics on his own and bring it to the band. It was very much more, even the lyrical process was very democratic. So Peter wrote most of the lyrics himself, and the band, they've described it as Peter was in one room writing the lyrics, writing the story. The band was in another room, basically writing most of the music. And Peter did write a few melodies here and there on the album, most notably the melody to the song Carpet Crawlers. But for the most part, other than that, it was the rest of the band who wrote most of the music, Peter who wrote most of the lyrics, and they sort of combined the two. Very ambitious project, of course. And it definitely is a lot grittier than a lot of the other double albums and concept albums that progressive rock bands were coming up with, of course, which matches the sort of the motif of the main character, the New York City setting. And that's all to its credit. And it's certainly a departure from the more pastoral songs that Genesis was making before this. Not all of them were very super pastoral, of course, but most of them had some of a tinge of Britishness, at least. Even the heavier songs sort of did. But here they completely abandon that and go completely very electric here. There's no 12-string guitars. There is some acoustic nylon guitar by Steve Hackett, and a few acoustic 12, maybe a one or not. I don't really think there's any acoustic 12-string. There might be some electric 12-string here and there. A few softer passages, but mostly pretty electric, pretty much heavier than they normally were. Which was all for the best. It was actually a very huge leap forward for their sound here, and really a progression in a musical sense, and of course in a lyrical and subject matter sense. Now the album after this, they would sort of fall back on some of the more the sounds they were doing on Selling England by the Pound for the following album, Trick of the Tail, which is a very good album. In fact, is one of the albums that might be the best entry point into the band. In fact, a very, very good album that sort of consolidated everything they did well up to that point. But so that the fact that they were progressing their sound, they did double back on that and go back the opposite way, but they still continue to do that with success. But it would have been interesting if Peter Gabriel had stayed in the band, if they had continued pushing this sort of edgy sound further, and they could have become sort of like a very edgy, kind of very idiosyncratic, punk adjacent kind of band, more in the way perhaps King Crimson became, or in the way some other a few other bands like Can and a few other more progressive bands sort of started to go in that direction of sort of the post-punk and the sort of underground music. When Peter Gabriel left, any chance the band would do that sort of fell by the wayside, and they stayed more strictly, a prog rock band, and didn't really. They made a few attempts to sort of integrate some of the new wave sort of sounds into their repertoire a few times with Phil Collins, but I think it would have there definitely would have been more of that with Peter Gabriel. And I think this album, on Peter Gabriel's part, just in sort of the story and sort of guiding the way the album was going, it did indicate the first attempt for Peter Gabriel to do something kind of new wave-ish, kind of in the, at least, I'm pretty sure he was aware of some of the more avant-garde stuff that was going on at this time. And the seeds of punk rock were just starting to form at this point in 1974 when they were creating this album. You did have some people like Patti Smith out there at this time, and Bruce Springsteen was also out there. Not that he was part of punk, but he sort of did influence a little bit. And Patti Smith was definitely very active at this point. And the New York Dolls and a few of these other proto-punk bands, and the Modern Lovers, of course, had released an album a few years before this. So that was sort of in the all in the ether, in the zeitgeist at the time this album was made. And I'm pretty sure it influenced Peter Gabriel in one way or another. So yeah, the band's really never done anything like this album. They did. Maybe Abacab is the album that most resembles The Lamb Lies Down at Broadway that came after it. And they certainly didn't do anything like this previous to it, and very little like it afterwards. Like I said, a little bit hinting toward it on Abacab, but not a whole lot. So they, this very unique piece of work in the band's canon, and there are people who aren't Genesis fans who really like this album, and there are huge Genesis fans who don't like this album. I'm a big Genesis fan, and I still think this album is great. So I think there's no reason why a Genesis fan shouldn't like this album, just because it's a little bit different. But the folks who are into more avant-garde stuff and more very, very off-the-wall stuff, who aren't necessarily Genesis fans, may like this album a lot, because there is some stuff that the band does here that's very like The Waiting Room, which is a sort of improvised noise rock instrumental. The band's never done anything like that at all, ever, since then, and very rarely did before. This double album, of course, it's very long, hard for me to do a track-by-track analysis, like I like to do a lot of times, but it really combines a lot of the band's strengths. There's a lot of creativity here. Tony Banks is doing a heck of a job on acoustic piano. This introduction to the opening track is brilliant, and the band are really clicking here. They sound very tight. Steve Hackett makes a few good contributions here and there. His guitar, as I mentioned before, is not the album before this, Selling England by the Pound, was probably the peak of Steve Hackett being featured on lead guitar, and here he takes a noticeable step in the background. He does rise to the surface on a few occasions, like the solo on the Flying Windshield, the introduction to Chamber of 32 Doors. It's a very nice solo there. He has a few solos on the second disc, Anyway, and on The Lamia, which is a beautiful song, written mostly by Tony Banks, but Steve has a great solo at the end. And on the song It, he sort of shares the melody with Tony Banks, sort of double tracking keyboards and guitars. And the song Careless Heart is also sort of mostly written by Steve. He's got some nice acoustic guitar on it. But other than that, like on a lot of the other tracks, he's almost invisible. He's invisible for long periods of time on the songs, and sort of just does coloring in the background, which is fine. But it would have been nice for him to be a little bit more prominent here. Like a song like In the Cage, barely audible in some sections, or is just doing some very much peripheral work, whereas Tony and Mike are doing most of the melody and most of the loud stuff you hear on the song. Phil's doing a lot on drums. And then when they play it live after Steve, they didn't even play it live once Peter Gabriel left until after Steve Hackett left the band, probably because he barely plays anything on that song. But then when they did play it live again with their new touring guitarist Daryl Sturmer, they actually added a lot of extra guitar parts onto it that weren't there before, which actually just only improves the song. So that's a very good track. In the Cages, of course, Proper Crawlers is a beautiful track. There's a lot of songs that work very well in isolation here. It is a long album to sit through, of course, especially if you're going to listen to both discs in one sitting. But what's nice is you can sort of listen to disc 1 and then take a break, and then wait a few days or wait a day and come back to disc 2 and pick up where you left off. And of course, disc 2 is more experimental than disc 1 is. There's a lot more instrumentals on it. It's still pretty good. It takes you a little bit more listens to get into, and maybe it takes a little bit, especially, it really takes a little too long for you to get to a song like the Lamia on disc 2, because there's a lot of jamming and a lot of sort of, I wouldn't call them throwaway, but sort of doodles, I guess, before you get to that point. You have the Waiting Room, and then you have Anyway, and the Supernatural Anesthetist, and those are okay, but there's not much to hook you in until you get to the Lamia, which is the 5th song on the 2nd CD. But if you're patient with it and give it a few extra listenings, it does pay off, and there's some great instrumental stuff. Also, the remix version of this album is I think much better to the original master. The remix that they released in 2008. It does feature Steve Hackett's guitar a little bit more. There's better separation with the instruments. I just think some of Tony Banks's dodgier keyboard parts are sort of dampened, which is good, because he did do a little too much on keyboards on this album, in my opinion. In a few places, like in a song like Back in New York City, the original version of it has a little bit too much keyboard on it. They cut some of that down, or just sort of dampened some of that in the remix in 2008. It's all for the better, and that song sounds a lot more powerful now in the 2008 remix, which is really nice. And Phil's drumming. Oh, by the way, it's some of the best drumming he ever did in his career here. He's really at the peak of his powers. Starting from this album, really, before this with Genesis, he was still a very good drummer, but his drumming wasn't, I guess, as disciplined as it became here, and it wasn't as dynamic and fluid as it became here. Part of it's that he expanded his kit. The band got a little bit of extra money. He had a few extra drums to his kit, so he's doing a lot more stuff, playing a lot more different sounds on his drums. He's also playing some vibraphone here, more percussive sounds here, more percussion too. So he's really pulling out all the stops as a drummer. And really, Phil, if you don't need any more proof that Phil Collins is an amazing drummer than to listen to Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. And just marvel at some of the things he's doing on some of these tracks. And that would continue, of course, on Trick of the Tail and Wind of Wuthering. He continues just this blazing hot streak that he started right here on Lamb Lies Down. For the next 2 or 3 Genesis albums, he does just flawless work on the drums, really. And then his drumming got a little bit more simplified in the 80s. And it was still good, but never quite as fluid or never quite as creative as it was at this point in his career. This was definitely Phil Collins at the height of his powers as a drummer here. And of course, he does a lot of he sings a lot of background vocals and does a lot of double tracking on vocals with Peter Gabriel, especially in the song like Carpet Crawlers. He's basically singing the main part of the chorus on that song, although you wouldn't really notice it because he blends in with Peter Gabriel's vocal lines so well. So yeah, this double album is very, very good. Perhaps not as good as Foxtrot because it's not as disciplined. It's more sprawling, obviously, as a lot of double albums can be. And so there's a little more extra stuff. But it's okay. And the fact that it is a double album, like I I mentioned in the We Can't Dance review that they should have made that a double album. And if you have a double album, it's okay. It's better if you're gonna do extra weird sprawling stuff. Then just go ahead and do it on a double album, and then you can sort of justify the length, and you can split up the listening chore that the listener has across 2 discs. You don't feel as a listener compelled to listen to everything in one sitting. You can you have a natural stopping point after the end of the first CD. And really, on the first CD, it is a lot tighter. There's a lot, there's 11 songs, and most of them are a real, verse, chorus types of songs that are pretty straightforward and easy to listen to. So, that first CD is sort of the more quote-unquote popish, I guess you could call it, although I put that in heavy quotes because it's still very, very progressive. But and then the jammier stuff is on the second CD, which your mileage may vary on that, and it'll take more time to get into that. But yeah, very good, very, very, very good album. I'd give it a B+. Again, yeah, it does get a little bit. Yeah, it does. There is a lot of extra stuff here that you're like just a lot of extra stuff. I wouldn't call it filler, but it just stuff that wouldn't have normally been released on an album. But that's both a pro and a con, because you get to peel back sort of what happens. A lot of the jams that they would do for the albums before this, they would cut, or they just use very small portions of them and work those bits into some of the songs. And here you're seeing some of the rawer side of the band, sort of the band keeping a lot of the stuff they would do in the studio and not leaving as much on the cutting room floor, which is interesting to hear that. Some of the product of what the band would spontaneously come up with on songs like The Waiting Room, for instance, or even like the Slipper Man song, or in the Rapids, or Riding the Screen and stuff like that on the second disc, which is interesting. It's not their best work ever, but it's certainly it's fun and interesting to hear them really pushing their limits here. So yeah, again, B+. Well worth picking up. And lots of pivotal songs that the band would play live a lot, like In the Cage, and like Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, and like Carpet Crawlers. Definitely those three have been played quite a lot in the Phil Collins era of the band live. And they also played it on the very first tour with Phil Collins. I wish they would have played that a little bit more, because it's a very good closing number to the album. Let's see what else they said. They played the instrumental version of Fly in a Windshield. Again, another song I wish they played a little bit more live. And unfortunately, they did end up cutting though a lot. They've never played the Lamia live, which is unfortunate, because that's a beautiful song. Very, very stands up very well on its own. I guess the band thought the lyrics were too specific to the story, but if you're going to play In the Cage live, you might as well play the Lamia, because it is a beautiful song. Great solo, like I said, by Steve Hackett at the end. Great stuff on piano by Tony Banks too. So, yeah. And they played back in New York City just a few times with Phil Collins during the Duke tour, but they had to abandon it because I think Phil, of course, as he always would do, would try to hit all those really high notes, without a falsetto, and just couldn't pull it off. So, yeah, very good album. Well worth spending some time with.